Welcome to Red Hen Radio, a podcast brought to you by Red Hen Press. We're a nonprofit publisher fostering diverse stories every year. On this podcast, you'll get to hear from the people who are inside the literary world, the authors and publishing professionals who are working hard to keep independent literature thriving. Stay with us as we introduce you to today's segment.
Hello, everybody. This is Toby Harper Petrie with Red Hen Press.
I'm Madeleine Nakamura. I'm a queer fantasy author from Los Angeles.
And I'm Molly Olguín, and I'm a writer and teacher, I guess, and monster fan. I'll put that in there.
Awesome. All right. So both of you are Red Hen authors, obviously. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about each of your books? Madeleine, would you mind starting?
My book is called Angel Eye. It's the sequel to my debut queer fantasy novel, Curse Breakers. The main character is a 41-year-old professor of magic and ex-physician who has bipolar disorder. He's named Adrian DeForno. In Angel Eye, as Adrian is recovering from the traumatic events of the first novel and getting his life back together, he learns that a healer at the city's biggest hospital has started killing patients. And he ends up entangled in the hunt for this angel of death serial killer at the same time as he's trying to explore a new romantic connection.
Right. Very cool. Molly, how about you?
My debut book just came out. It's called The Sea Gives Up the Dead. And I am calling The Sea Gives Up the Dead a book of queer fairy tales about death. So some of those are literal fairy tales. I've got a retelling of The Little Mermaid in there. And some of those are more weird fairy tales, I would say. I've got a story that I still think of as a fairy tale, but that is actually about a mother who goes on a voyage to find her son's grave after World War I.
Definitely very cool. I love that retelling of The Mermaid. I'm a little obsessed with the Hans Christian Andersen storytelling of The Little Mermaid, or the original, I guess I should say. I thought it was excellent. Very cool. So, were there stories or genres that you felt excluded from growing up, and did that inspire you to write The Sea Gives Up the Dead, or Madeleine, in your case, Curse Breakers and Angel Eye?
I feel like I have a million answers to this question. I'm going to try to be concise, but probably will layer some stuff on here. So I did this activity at a workshop a couple years ago called Your Sexuality Timeline. I was paired with a couple straight people, and they asked, when was the first time you saw someone with your same sexuality in a story, in a book? And all the straight people were like, I don't remember. The first story I read, probably. And I was like, I remember distinctly. I was 14 and I was reading Lord of the Rings fan fiction online. And that sense of oh, where do I find myself? And it's truly in these spaces that were being made by other queer people in online spaces, because I just didn't feel like I had access to queer stories at all as a child or growing up. And then I had the gift of being a huge nerd and an English major in undergrad. And so I remember I was in this class, this professor, this amazing queer professor was like, okay, so you may be asking yourself, where is the queer classics? Where's the queer Shakespeare, the queer Hemingway, the queer Lorraine Hansberry? And then she leaned in and she was like, you're going to be excited to learn. It's Shakespeare, it's Lorraine Hansberry, and it's Hemingway. The mirror of seeing myself in this classic literature, if I am able to decode the subtext, was a huge gift. And then I feel like my final evolution and my final form was going, oh, okay, but now I'm going to still love subtext, but maybe be post-subtext, both as a human being and then try to have that in my work as well. So I feel like that's a very roundabout way of saying I feel like I had a journey from feeling like I didn't see myself to realizing I could if I had a puzzle decoder, to wanting to make people decode other stuff in my work, but the queerness is on top.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. Yeah, Moby Dick did that for me also in grad school. I had a professor who somehow didn't realize it was a queer text. So I made my final paper all about how queer that book was. Madeleine, how about you?
I have a much different and probably more fortunate answer. Personally fortunate for me in terms of queerness or gender. I actually kind of didn't have a great sense of feeling excluded from any genres growing up, not particularly because given my age and very fortunate individual circumstances, I had plenty of exposure to queer art as a kid, plenty of art featuring women leads. It might not have always necessarily been the most amazing representation, but I had it. And so while I had this feeling of there is less of this than there might be for other people, I didn't feel oh, I don't see myself anywhere. The problems that I had with those parts of my identity manifested more in different parts of my life, not so much with fiction.
It brings me much more hope that you did not have so much of that, because I feel like that's all I had. We remember most what we had in the beginning when we were first being exposed. And I only remember the worst tragic things. And then now I'm feel like I'm getting a drink of cool water every time I read a book where the person doesn't die at the end.
I will say I remember almost no art featuring Asian characters from my childhood. The only time I remember encountering a story with an Asian character like in my childhood was there was a kid's book about the young daughter of a soldier who was killed at Pearl Harbor, who then goes to find a Japanese American girl to hit with a baseball bat. And that's the only story featuring an Asian character that I remember interacting with as a kid. It was not until I was older that you could see an Asian actor on TV as like anything other than a bit part. In terms of Angel Eye, I would say the gap I'm trying to fill pertains more like disability. Part of my motivation behind writing the series was that there is not a lot of fantasy featuring a main character who has a stigmatized mental illness like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia that is an actually compassionate and accurate portrayal. People who have those mental illnesses are not really allowed to be protagonists in books or movies or anything. So I thought that writing a novel from the perspective of a character with bipolar disorder and allowing the novel to treat that character as a fully realized person with a serious point of view would be my contribution toward filling a gap that I was perceiving.
Yeah, absolutely. We've published a few books that feature main characters or narrators with disabilities. And while we were pitching the book and we were getting a little bit of pushback from marketing people here and there, we were giving them the statistic that like 25% of Americans have a physical disability. So the fact that we don't have more stories that feature people with disabilities is wild to me. So yeah, that's one of our main selling points with Curse Breakers and Angel Eyes. It's so underrepresented, especially sexuality and disability together are often so underrepresented.
Madeline, I was just really struck by what you were saying about that first kind of horrifying story of like seeing another Asian character represented and thinking about how like that was also the first published work that I remember seeing with a queer character. It was a very similar moment of kind of messed up representation. It was about another teenager who was queer bashed. And like that was the first time I remember reading about a queer character. That like sense of like tragic stories, tragic queer stories really was everything that I read all through my like teen years into my early 20s. And I feel like that sense of these are the ways that I'm seeing stories reflected really impacted my writing and definitely impacted the way that I talk about queer literature with my friends. And I think I'm also a high school teacher. And so when I see my students responding to Love, Simon or like Heartstopper, I'm like, oh, I'm so happy you get these really happy stories.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, I grew up with like Stone Butch Blues and Brokeback Mountain. And I mean, even in Buffy.
Yeah.
Tara
Right.
still dies in Buffy.
Tara dies horribly. I don't think we got good ones. I mean, even then people are like, oh, what about The Kids Are All Right? You're like the one where she cheats on her wife with the bio dad? Don't give me that. I don't know if I even have a good one now. Is there one yet? Like an actual mainstream movie where it's queer and it's not tragic or cheating?
There has to be.
I think
There has to be.
I think I'm just
Why am I not?
clearly
I'm
not enough.
I'm going to kick myself in like 5 minutes because I'll think of the perfect answer for a movie. But I will say lots of TV shows. I feel like TV
Yeah,
has maybe
TV's
been able
doing
to do
good.
this.
I will
Yeah.
say that Dark Angel back in the day had a solid one that was not tragic.
That's right.
Yeah,
I forgot about Dark Angel.
I did not. I'll always remember Dark Angel.
There's a very interesting conversation in queer fantasy circles right now about how all queer lit is so sanitized and happy and there's never any room for drama. And the way that it's talked about is like, oh, this is like a huge problem. It's always been this way. Like, no.
No, I think the pendulum is
think
just
that's
swinging
fair.
too hard in that direction, maybe. And maybe it'll even out, but
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are trying to soak it up because it did not used to be like that. Even 10 years ago, I don't think it was like that.
No, I think you're completely right. It's the pendulum swinging, and like we needed the movement, but also we don't want to just apply a Puritan mindset to queer literature. That's not great either.
You know, I just realized that your book definitely complicates the queer. It is not a pure, happy queer experience. You definitely have the balance in there.
Thank you. I hope I do. I wanted to put not just total tragedies in there, but yeah, I do have
I mean,
a
it's
lot
not
of.
the happiest, but it's definitely
No.
interesting. It's a good balance.
When I went back to revise the book, I actually did put more happy or happy-ish endings in because I realized it was too much of a bummer the first time around. But yeah, trying to balance that pendulum a little bit.
Yeah, I think you did some good balancing there. So, what kind of response have you received from queer readers, and how has that shaped how you think about your work? Molly, yours just came out. How much have you gotten so far?
So I was really lucky to have my in-person book launch be at a queer bookstore here in Seattle.
Nice.
Shout out to Charlie's Queer Books. They're amazing. I had my launch with 2 other queer women of color. And so that was just like a beautiful way to bring the book to life. And then the coolest part was people came to the reading and then came up to the signing afterward who I didn't know. Oh my gosh, you don't know me. You came just because you were like, this is like a queer book at a queer bookstore and I want to hear this person read fairy tales. And I genuinely just had this feeling of, oh my gosh, this is my big family and I love you and I'm so happy that you're here.
Madeleine, I know you've gotten some feedback. I've seen some of it at book fairs.
Yeah, I would say by and large, the reception has been really good. I've gotten some impassioned emails that I treasure. People have come up to me specifically already knowing who I am, which always blows my mind. It's been really good. I would say I don't think that anyone loves the book specifically because of its handling of queerness. My goal in writing it wasn't necessarily to say anything new in that regard. I have things to say. I just don't know that any of it is something that hasn't been said like more eloquently by someone else. I wouldn't necessarily expect a particular response from queer readers beyond, hey, it's cool that there's another queer fantasy novel out there that might suit my taste. And I think that queer authors should be allowed to tackle projects that have other subjects as like their primary focus, their primary goal. The people who have had the most intense reaction to the books actually have been other disabled people, although mostly when I get contacted by someone, they are also queer. I think that that also makes sense. Beneath the like fantastical plot and setting, the core theme that the book is grappling with is really like mental illness and disability. So the people who send me like the most passionate communications about like, this really spoke to me, I felt like I know something new about myself now, this made me cry, have usually mentioned disability as like the primary thing that affected them.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, I think that's a part of the modern balance is that the books don't have to be about being queer. 20 years ago, every book about being queer was about coming out as queer, because if it was queer, that had to be all it was about. And now you can just have queer characters who happen to be queer, but that's not the central point of the story.
Yeah, I think it's 2 equally important endeavors, making art that is about being queer. And I would never want to say that the way forward for queer literature is to write stories where it's not a big deal. I think that that would be missing something in a major way. But there's also equally room for queer creators to take aim at other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel now that the publishing industry is more receptive to queer speculative fiction, or are there still significant barriers?
The path I've had to publishing The Seekers of the Dead has been like a bit of a weird one. So I don't actually feel like I really know in an intimate sense what it's like trying. I don't know what it would be like to try to query The Seekers of the Dead because I didn't do that. I just sent it out to contests and that's how I arrived with Red Hen, which was really lovely.
Yeah.
But I will say, I feel like I have a lot more to read now than I used to, and that's really delightful. I'm just going to quickly shout out some of my favorites because I am really, really grateful to get to read books like Shelley Parker Chan's She Who Became the Sun and He Who Drowned the World. I just finished teaching The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nevo, and it's such a gift every single year. It's like, oh, one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. And everything by T. Kingfisher is just a total joy. So I feel grateful to be in a literary world that's giving me stories like those.
Do you find those are coming from independent presses, or are you getting those also from big corporate ones?
I feel like it's a ton of independent presses, and then there's the weird imprints of the big ones.
Yeah, that's what I found. I was talking with an author the other day who has a beautiful novel that's all about queerness and has a big 5 publisher, but the big 5 publisher basically just gently said, oh, we don't know how to do this justice. So, we're not going to be able to take it on. Not because it wasn't beautifully written, not because she wasn't a really popular author, but from what I've heard from editors who are in those circles on the acquisitions meeting, they're hearing things like, oh, well, we're already publishing one Asian author that season, so I don't think we can do a second one because they'll compete with each other. And the sorts of like tokenizing that I would have hoped we were past, but I guess this was 2 years ago. So clearly we are not past that. And even in major houses that are publishing, I think, hundreds of books. I found it pretty distressing. The editor telling me was also fairly distressed. Well, what about you, Madeleine? How do you feel about the publishing industry being receptive to queer speculative fiction?
So I can really only speak to what I'm seeing in SFF circles. I think that with fantasy in particular, there's more leeway for queer books. I think it's both, like publishing is more receptive undoubtedly, but there are still significant barriers. I actually think that those 2 things converge a little bit. And again, like just talking about what I see in fantasy circles, because that's where I pay the most of my attention. I think that it's much easier nowadays for a queer book to find a home, but it will probably face more difficulty in doing so. I think that publishing is more receptive to queer art in a lot of ways, of course, still to like a limited extent, but because we've reached the point where it's possible for queer art to be profitable enough to pursue. I do want to make the caveat. I think there's less allowance made for trans stories and authors. I'm not talking about book bans and all, just
Right.
purely in terms of which fantasy and sci-fi books find a home. I think that big publishers do take on a fair number of queer books that get pretty popular in terms of fantasy because they can sell them now, and that's obviously great, but like the key here is the profitability, and that means that the publishing industry exerts pressure on what mainstream queer literature looks like, what mainstream queer fantasy looks like, by selecting for stories that don't stray too far from marketability. If it's cozy, you're going to have to make it cozy in a way that Book Talk is going to enjoy. If it's dark, you're going to have to make it dark in a way that a different other section of Book Talk will enjoy. And that's obviously true for all authors, maybe all creators on earth at this point. I don't know, but women and people of color especially. Marketability is a huge monster for everyone. But I think that because queerness is still regarded as a niche that needs to be like really precisely tuned and aimed in order to turn a profit, the effect is much more pronounced.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There are certain genres that have hard rules. Like if I'm marketing anything that I even refer to as a romance in any way, the first quick question I get is, does it have a happy ending? And I say, well, yeah, it's a romance. And they're like, good, that's the rule. You cannot call it romance unless there's a happy ending where they end up together. You can't stray from that. There's a lot of hard rules like that. Did you know Red Hen accepts unsolicited submissions year-round? No literary agent required. We also have 5 annual awards for writers. If you have a manuscript you'd like to submit for publication, visit redhen.org for more information. You can also find the link in our show notes. We'd love to read your work. What advice would you give emerging queer authors who want to write speculative fiction but worry about marketability or acceptance?
I would say there's really no point in worrying at all. For marketability, as you write and read and develop a sense of your own tastes, you're going to discover what your limit for making concessions toward marketability is. To clarify, I'm not saying that a marketable book is a bad book. I think it's artistically neutral. It's just a thing that writers will have to grapple with, and some people will have an easier time than others. But like, it's barely a decision, because as you write, you'll discover what your limit is, and there's never going to be a reward worth having for pushing yourself beyond that amount that you're willing to concede. In terms of acceptance, there's also really no point worrying, I would say. You're not going to appease hateful people by trying and trying and trying as an author. It's not your job. It's mostly impossible anyway. But I would think that most queer writers are most worried about incurring judgment from their peers. Like, we're all walking around constantly worried that somebody else is going to tell us, like, you're doing it wrong, you're being queer wrong. And I think that that happens, obviously, but you create this panopticon in your head before you've ever shown anyone anything that you've written. I don't think that that's necessary. It's not worth worrying about. You can take care that you approach your work with a normal human level of responsibility, but if you obsess over contorting your work into being acceptable to every faction of people who could ever possibly take issue with you, it's going to be bad. You're going to resent the thing that you make. It's going to be shapeless and formless and featureless, and people are still going to be mad at you. People will still make assumptions about you, and they will email you about those assumptions. People are still going to be mad. You might as well also be happy with your work. Just skip the agonizing, I would say.
That's a really great point. Wow. Molly, what would you add?
Oh God, I mean, all of that for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like before you even get to the question of worrying about like acceptance or worrying about marketability, you have to figure out how to write it down. The question for the first thing is what actually matters to me. Like, I know all the rest of it does matter, but until you figure out how to tell the story you want to tell, it can't matter, right? I feel like the big secret to writing that I wish I had known when I was younger, even though I totally did know this, people told me and I just didn't believe them, was that you have to write what you want to write. Whatever story that is, however weird it is, however niche it is, you have to write what you want to write or it's not going to work. Figuring out how to sell that, figuring out how other people are going to respond to that is a later problem. And it's not that it's not real, but you can't worry about that part before you just tell the story you really want to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell people write to write, don't write to publish. You've got to get it down on paper, edit later, talk to editors, fine, but write to write. The marketability always makes me think of this beer billboard I saw that was one of those mainstream beers, and their motto was superior drinkability. And I always think about that when people are talking about marketability of books, is just watering it down enough so that it's got superior drinkability. I agree with resisting that. Well, I mean, I work at an independent press, so of course I'm resisting the drinkability of a book. I deal with that a bit with marketing books. Obviously, I do deal with marketability, but even with marketing books, I've gotten advice about, oh, this is the main character in this book is a lesbian, that's a smaller market. You should really try to maybe hide that in the marketing you're doing. And I was just like, you want me to not find the lesbian audience for this book, and find who? Find someone who's going to be surprised to find a lesbian, but haha, I tricked you into buying the book. So I ignored that advice. And it was the bestseller of that season because it found its market. It found the people who wanted it. And, it's not only lesbians to enjoy the book. It's a funny book. Sugarland by Tammy Lynn Stoner was back in 2018 was when I actually first started working full-time in marketing. I just always think about that. Just lean into the strength of whatever that book is. Don't pretend like it's something else. Why would I do that? Aim for the niche, and then it ripples out to everyone else.
I love that so much. And that actually reminded me of something you said, Madeleine. If you're making a book, if you're trying to either write or sell a book to appeal to everyone, I'm writing a book for people who hate me. I'm trying to sell my book to people who hate me. I don't want them to like the book. I don't want them to buy the book, right? I want the people who the book is for to want to like and buy the book.
Right. And also, if you say, oh, it's for everyone, it's not for everyone. Everyone's not going to buy it. They're not even going to find it if you're trying to find everyone. You have to find your actual people, and those people will want it and buy it, and then talk to their people who will want it and buy it.
A book for everyone is a book for nobody on earth, basically.
Really? Yeah. Are there queer speculative fiction communities or spaces, online or otherwise, that helped you along the way?
This is hard for me to answer because all of my friends are queer writers, basically, but I wouldn't say that I'm a part of any writing communities. Every time that I've really tried to go into a space that's pre-designed for writing critique and exchange, the experience is always oh, this sucks. And it's more of an organic partnership with people that I just kind of happen to know who all happen to be interested in the same kind of fantasy. But most of my community is online, I would say.
Similarly, I feel like the more formalized writing communities that I've had have been people who are working in really different genres than me, who maybe aren't also fiction writers, or maybe aren't also queer, or maybe aren't also doing spec fic. And so I feel like it's been a little more of a hodgepodge. But I will say, I already copped to this earlier. I grew up in fan fiction communities.
Right.
Those were queer spec fic spaces. That's when I was a little baby learning how to write, and also just learning how to lay claim to stories that I wanted to tell. And so I will absolutely give a little hat tip to fan fiction. I feel like that was super important to little baby self.
Yeah, I feel like fan fiction was all we used to have, and now finally it's becoming actual published fiction.
My first book is dedicated to somebody that I met on the internet in one of these circles. Yes.
Nice.
I love that.
Very cool. So there have been a lot of amazing reviews and acknowledgments for your books, and a lot of readers are talking about The Sea Gives Up the Dead and Angel Eye. So what would you like to say to your readers who have picked up your book, been spreading the word about your book, and are leaving positive reviews? Or any review, I suppose.
Oh my God. I mean, I feel like it's really simple. I love you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, I'm just very, very grateful, and I'm always very excited. And it's a whole new shock every time somebody says something positive about the book. So also, yeah, just thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And a final question, surprise, final question. What advice would you give to queer readers who are looking for more books? What recommendations do you give them for how to find them, who to talk to, or I suppose any specific books if you just know that they have got to read that one?
It's a fantastic question. I feel like how to find books, go to your local independent bookstore and make friends, because I'm really lucky to live near a bunch of really cool indie bookstores, and every single bookseller that I've met is excited to give me book recommendations, or even just read the little write-ups and see what people are excited about who work in that bookstore. That's my favorite way to find new books. And then I am gonna specifically recommend the collection Love After the End, which is the book of queer indigenous stories about the post-apocalypse. And it's so beautiful. I teach from that book. It's got a bunch of just amazing stories from lots of different kinds of speculative fiction.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I would second the advice about bookstores. I get most of my book recommendations through friends of mine who read a lot more than I do, honestly. So I don't have like an established strategy. But I would say anyone who enjoyed my books would probably enjoy Catherine Addison's work or C.L. Polk's work.
Cool. Great advice. All right. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate you being here talking about queer lit and your incredible books. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Red Hen Radio, the podcast where independent literature takes flight. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join us once a month for an in-depth look into publishing as we share interviews, resources, and advice for readers and writers. Keep up to date by subscribing to the Red Hen Radio podcast on your favorite listening platform. Join us on Substack for a detailed feature of our episodes, plus additional resources. Follow us on social media at Red Hen Press to stay updated on our newest episodes, latest books, industry news, and literary events. This program is brought to you by Red Hen Press, Inc., a nonprofit publisher of diverse stories. Interviews are unscripted and are edited for clarity. The views of guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Red Hen Press or its staff. Special thank you to our supporters who have generously contributed to the making of this podcast. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you as well to our Red Hen podcasting team, Samantha Diaz on media and marketing, Piper Gorley on sound editing, and Kate Gale and Toby Harper-Petrie on the mic. Tremendous thank yous to our special guests for their generosity of time and wisdom. For more information, find us at redhenpress.com. In the meantime, keep reading, keep writing, and keep dreaming. Talk to you soon.